standardization of time, which is not at all my research area. So thank you, anonymous nominator, for giving me this excuse to sort of play today. I did write and report and write a short magazine story earlier this year on the time zones in Indiana, and that got me thinking about the kind of deep strangeness of time zones and their uneven achievement globally. And so I want you to think with me now about that strangeness just for a minute. After this introductory half minute, or I guess for 5 minutes, after this introductory half minute, I'll say a few words about the history of standardization. Then I'll talk about Indiana in particular, and then I'll zoom out to the globe. Okay, so if you're going to tell time in a way that involves something called noon, then the most obvious place to put that noon is the moment when the sun is at its highest in the sky. So to set clock noon in line with solar noon. But if each of us were to set her own watch that way, then we'd have a problem, a kind of social and legal and commercial problem. Because every person has a kind of slightly different solar noon depending on where she's sitting. So my relation to the sun, and therefore my solar noon, by virtue of my unique subject position, my literal subject position, is just slightly different from Ellery's. So up until the middle of the 19th century, towns and cities with clock time would just agree to set one collective solar noon, one collective clock noon, right, which is sort of right around their collective solar noon. But then came the Industrial Revolution and the railroads, and suddenly that wasn't quite enough standardization for everybody. So just for now, let's take the US as our case. In 1883, the railway companies, and then during World War II, the US federal government all agreed to divide up the country into 4 big standard time zones. Meanwhile, many other countries, although not all other countries, were doing versions of the same thing, one by one. Okay, before we leave the American context, in 1918, when the US Congress passed its act adopting as law the railway's idea of standard time zones, it didn't specify where exactly those time zones lines should be drawn. Instead, it left it up to something called the Interstate Commerce Commission, which itself basically left it up to states. And what makes Indiana special is that Indiana responded by saying, you know what, we're going to leave it up to our counties because we really like chaos. And so as of today, 12 counties in Indiana have picked Central Time. Those are the ones in the corners, which are right next to Chicago and Evansville, which makes sense because those are the ones that are in, those are cities that are in Central. And the other 80 counties have chosen Eastern Time, which is the time zone of Wall Street. One guy who I talked to for this little magazine story that I wrote, this guy works for a small business called Huntingburg Veterinary and Poultry Supply. This business is in the middle of Huntingburg, it's in the middle of the state, it's on a time zone border. The guy put like this: noon lunchtime for some customers is 1 p.m. our time. You think it's 2 different countries, but really they're coming from right down the darn road. The other thing that makes Indiana awesome is that much of it only recently came around to daylight savings time. It wasn't mandatory until 2005, and people will tell you that there are some townships in Indiana that still haven't come around to DST. So at this moment, there are places in Indiana where it is 1:29, there are places where it's 12:29, and there are places where it's 11:29. What all of this amounts to is one more way in which a state can act as what Justice Louis Brandeis called a laboratory of democracy. It's also, as my veterinarian supply source put it, a darn lot to keep track of. Okay, back to the rest of the world. The last thing I want to show you is this amazing map, which is something somebody sent me on Twitter, not my line drawing. This was made by a math blogger and Google software engineer named Stefano Maggiolo, and it compares standard time to solar time. The colors register distance between clock noon and solar noon. In the places colored deep red, solar noon happens long after clock noon, whereas in those colored deep green, it's the opposite. There are about 1 million things to be said about this and sort of asked about this map, and I think I love it just because I look at it and I think, what deep irrationality, what kind of wild unevenness continually vexed the effort to rationalize the world for capitalism. But for now, I just want to ask you what questions or thoughts, if any, does this map bring up for you? And my question for you to talk about as we talk together, how, without being merely instrumental or practical, might we find ways to incorporate the kind of avocational elements of our interests or practices ourselves, like this one for me, into the Berkman space and into our intellectual community together? Thank you.